Hi, my name's Noel. I'm the host of the Wellbeing Show, and I've got a great guest on this week. Sam Delaney has jumped in again, even after I managed to forget him last time because of work. So thankfully, he's forgiven me and come back on the show again. I'm really excited to have him here. Sam's a long and honourable. I was going to say dishonourable. I don't know you well enough to say it was dishonourable history in sort of being a lad and being a guy, and then getting the light and joining us in the world of blokes who take their health and well-being a bit more seriously. Hey Sam, how you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me. This is great to be here now.
It's really, really good to have you on, man after my own heart, really. Sort of, you've had your road to Damascus moment and decided to share some of that with people, which I think is very courageous of you. And I know you're committed to sort of sharing your experiences in a way that are accessible. If you don't mind, I might look back a little bit in time to you were working in the music industry, I think, originally, were you? Or have I got that wrong?
No. I
Right.
started in magazines in the late 90s when there was a real boom in the magazine industry, and I left university just wanting to be involved in it. This is the era of like Loaded kind of taking off, and amongst my generation, that was a sort of a defining magazine, and there was lots of other magazines like it, and there was a sort of an atmosphere in that industry, and I knew I wanted to sort of write for a living, and I thought that's what I want to do. But I couldn't get to the places that I originally applied to, like Loaded and the NME. So I took a job on Men's Health, funnily enough, which was a
Oh,
real outlier at that time because
yeah.
it was a big hit magazine, but it was unlike any other magazine. It wasn't like the Style mags or the Lad mags. It was about health, mainly physical health, but also, I suppose it did have a strong mental health element to it as well. And I just did that as a foot in the door and got a bit of experience and got into the industry. And then I moved on. And over the next sort of, I don't know, like 5 to 10 years, I kind of worked on a lot of different, more laddie mags. And I did write about music as well during that era for the NME, for the Guardian, and sort of, had some good times flying around interviewing rock stars, which was great.
Yeah. And what got you into the writing and the university? What was your background? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in West London, we grew up on a council estate and went to a normal comprehensive school. But I was exposed to the possibility of doing creative things for a living.
Okay.
Because although I didn't work, although I never lived with my dad, me and my three brothers were raised by our mum, single mum. But my dad, who I never lived with, did have a career in the advertising industry. And so I was, unlike a lot of kids from my background, I was aware of the feasibility of being able to get paid for coming up with ideas and
Okay.
being creative. So I was very lucky in that sense. And then I had three older brothers who left school very young, sort of bombed out of school as early as they could, but then worked to get into the creative industries. Not as writers, they were like making commercials or doing bits and bobs in the film industry, but I could see that they'd worked hard, and they were a lot older than me. There's a 7-year gap between my youngest brother and me, right? So my brothers are like, I think one's 10 years older, one's 8 years older, one's 7 years older. So I really looked up to them, and without my dad around, they were sort of like my male role models, and they were really like hardworking, and they sort of like kind of forced their way in without any qualifications to various different sort of quite creative jobs in Soho. I used to go up to Soho after school in my school uniform to hang around outside pubs with them and meet the interesting people they were working with. And yeah, so I took a lot of inspiration from that. But I was also quite political, and I actually took a year off before I went to university, and spent that year working. I managed to get some work experience for an MP at Westminster, and I basically became a tea boy for Harriet Harman when Labour was still in opposition.
Okay.
This is in the 90s before Tony Blair came to power. And at that stage, because I'd done a politics A-level and I was going off to study politics at university, I thought, this is what I want to do. And my colleagues and contemporaries during that period were Ed Miliband was the other researcher who worked for Harriet Harman at the time. He was senior to me, but we worked together. And Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper, these were the other researchers who subsequently went on to be cabinet ministers. And I sort of thought, I could see myself. I mean, I was not on their level. They were older than me. They were smarter than me. And to be honest, I was just making cups of tea and carrying bags. They were like already writing speeches and whatnot. But I thought, you know what? I'm quite passionate about politics, and I'm doing a politics degree, and I can see myself coming back here. And it was indicated to me that if I wanted to, after I graduate, come back and work there in some capacity, I might have a chance of doing so. But then I spent 3 great years at university, and by the time I came out the other end, all I wanted to do was work in magazines. I thought, sod politics, that's boring. I want to fly around the world, drink for free, party for free, meet my heroes, stand backstage at rock concerts, go to football matches, and I want to get paid for it all. This is what I want to do. And so that's what I'd set out to do.
It sort of sounds a bit attractive to me, apart from the drinking and using. But was that shoe drinking and using then? Because I know it later becomes part of your story. Was it then?
Yeah, all the way through my life, really. I mean,
right.
You know, from the age of about 12, in the school I went to and the environment I grew up in, drink and drugs were just a part of like normal everyday life.
Yeah.
And I associated it with, I thought it was normal, and I associated it actually with being kind of cool, I suppose. You know, I looked up to my brothers. They were all kind of Jack the lads, quite hedonistic, you know, spent all their time in pubs. And then by the time I came of age, you know, clubbing was also a big thing, and ecstasy and whatnot. And, you know, we were smoking weed and getting drunk in the park from about 12 years of age onwards. The thing about it was, though, is that because in the environment I grew up in, it was so prevalent, I was never like one of the worst people. I was like, you know, even amongst my mates, let alone my brothers and their friends were much older than me, and they seemed much more extreme. And even my mates from school, most of them, you know, I was never one of the people who was particularly bad, but I just did it normally. And I think I look back now and I think that was the problem with drink and drugs, is that it just seems so normal. And I never seemed, you know, you always compare yourself to other people and think, well, I can't be that bad. I'm not like him. I'm not drinking in the morning, or I'm not smoking weed from the moment I get up, or whatever it is. You always find someone who's worse than you. And so it just sort of sat there for a lot of my life. It was just something that was there, and it would come in fits and starts. And so, but I never really saw it as a problem. And I think that's precisely why it did become a big problem when I hit a crisis in my late 30s.
Well, starting to drink at 12 is a problem, I would say. Clinically, we know that. Sort of the advice is you don't touch alcohol before the age of 16. That's the medical advice, because of the impact it has neurologically. So, I mean, our understanding of alcohol now is much better these days than it used to be. But I'm just out of interest. Your dad wasn't around because
they got divorced when I was about 1. My mum and dad. So he had been around through a lot of my brother's childhood. And then I came along after a 7-year gap. And within a year, my dad left. He'd met another woman, and they split up, but he didn't disappear completely. I mean, he left us in not ideal circumstances by any means, but he was a presence in my life. Okay. For sure. You know, weekend dad, basically. Yeah.
Okay. So you saw him and sort of had some sort of relationship to him?
Yeah, we had a relationship. It was a strange one. It didn't seem strange at the time, because when you're a kid, you know, you just go with whatever's going on, you think is normal. I look back now and it was a strange relationship in lots of ways, because although he was very present in my life, he lived a life that was really so far removed from my own and that of my mum and my brothers. And so it was rather confusing for me in lots of ways, because
Well, I imagine your mum struggled a bit financially. She had
Yeah, we were living a very sort of working class lifestyle, and it was quite chaotic in our home. It was a very loving home, but it was very chaotic and volatile because, you know, she was working full time.
yeah,
She was always skint, and my brothers were adolescents who'd been through quite a lot of trauma that they experienced during the divorce, much more than I did because I was a baby. I was sort of unaware of it, and you know, they were a bit off the rails, and it was a difficult time for them. It was a very difficult time for my mum.
yeah,
And yeah, and sort of, you know, we had there was a lot of laughter, but there was a lot of struggle and quite a lot of conflict. And my dad would sort of breeze in once every, you know, maybe once every second weekend and pick me up. And by this stage, he was doing very well in his industry, which he hadn't been before he left. It was one of those things where his career took off just as he was leaving us. And he'd turn up in a nice car, and I'd get in the car, and sometimes he'd take me to a nice restaurant, or we'd go and hang out with some of his friends or his family, and I'd feel very out of place because it just wasn't a world that I lived in for most of my life. And so I felt a bit, you know, I had to take on different identities. I had a very different identity at home and at school than I did at the weekend, when I would sort of struggle to kind of fit in with my dad. And in the course of therapy and just reflecting more and writing about this in my book, I kind of came to realize that really you just learn to pretend to be okay when you're a kid, I think. And I just think that I wanted to pretend to my dad that I was okay and everything was great, and the fact that they weren't together was no issue to me, and that I was happy to fit in with his life at the weekend. And I've pretended to my mum that everything's okay, but really, like, you sort of, as a kid, you're kind of almost working overtime to show your parents, to make your parents feel better about themselves.
I think that's correct. Yeah, egocentricity. Kids are worried that, well, because we're dependent on our parents, and so if they can't cope, we're done for. So we do everything we can to make sure they can cope.
Yeah, exactly. And while I don't blame either of them really for anything negative, it was, you know, just the circumstances were what they were. They were both trying in their own way to do the best they could. I think even my dad, I just think he was trying, but he didn't see that it was difficult for me, and I wasn't telling him that it was difficult for me. And then, you know, years later, it all catches up with you. Yeah. And you say, well, this is how I actually felt. And that must be really difficult. I don't think my dad's, still got a good relationship with my dad, but I don't think he's read my book. And I think he swerves certain parts of my output that might touch upon these themes. And I can understand that. I often think, you know, I've got a great relationship with my kids. You know, I do live with them and their mum. And I think we get on like a house on fire, but I don't doubt that a time will come at some stage, maybe in their middle age or whatever, where they will look back and perhaps think, well, you could have done this a bit better, or I didn't feel particularly happy about that.
There's a thing called normally neurotic, which is fine. And in a sense, if you don't disappoint your kids, they never grow up. I mean, that's, if you do magically meet all their needs, they'd still be in nappies in their 40s, right? So
quite.
You have to disappoint them to some extent. But there's a difference between that, which is like normal, healthy development, and what you're describing that you grew up with, which is what would be called adverse childhood experiences. So ACEs are sort of evidence-based insights into the types of experiences children can have growing up, which are adverse enough to have a significant impact on their development. And so you're describing ACE scores, and ACEs are something people can just go and check out for themselves. If they go ACEs, child development, they'll see there's quite a strong evidence base for it. So you did experience quite a few ACEs. It's interesting, I think, and I'm, you know, a co-parent as well. I am a co-parent. You're not a co-parent, but I am a co-parent, and sort of these types of questions come up for me about how I'm involved in my son's life. Whereas I guess your dad didn't even think about that. He sort of, it
No,
wasn't a question he brought up for himself. I think quite a lot about. I make sure that I've got a good co-parenting relationship, and I think through that, I make sure that I'm available for my son in ways that my dad never had the capacity for. It's like the question would not have occurred to him.
yeah,
And that's, again, I'm not. I don't have any bitterness about any of that. It's just a fact, right?
yeah.
I had a dad who it would never have crossed his mind to be at all anxious about whether or not he was emotionally close to me. So,
Yeah. I mean, the story I told myself, and sometimes my dad, again, trying to make me feel better when I was younger, was, in a sense, I felt that because he wasn't around, in a way, that motivated him to make more of an effort. By which I mean, he would take us on holiday. Me and my brothers, he'd take us on holiday once a year when he was earning good money. Or he'd take me out somewhere really special, and I don't think he like spoiled me. He wasn't like, come on, I'm going to buy your love, we're going to Disneyland. But, he did think things through. I remember he'd get time out, and he'd look, this is the 80s, and he'd like look in the pages where it would like be interesting things to do at the weekend and stuff like that. Yeah. And I sort of thought to myself, I wonder if, I'd go around my mates' houses, and most of my mates, they did have dads living at home, and some of them were right misery guts who'd just sit, in front of the telly, reading the paper, not paying much attention to anything. And I think, oh, well, at least when I see my dad, he's like more or less on form. Do you know what I mean? He's turned up with an idea and something to do. And so I did like that, and I told him that as well. Because I want, like I say, I wanted him to feel like I appreciated him and that everything was okay with me. But yeah, emotionally, it was a bit different, because emotionally he felt a little bit removed. And I also felt quite alienated from his life, his lifestyle. Yeah. Even my relatives on his side of the family, we would go to family events, and, I felt that there was a pressure on me to smile and fit in. But I never quite felt that I did. And there was never any emotional sort of conversations at all between me and my dad about how we felt about each other or anything like that. Or he'd never make any inquiry. I don't suppose that's particularly different to anyone of my generation, because we all had dads of a particular generation. But mind you, he sees it the same way. I asked him recently if he had many conversations with my granddad, and he just laughed at the very notion and just said, I never had a meaningful conversation with my dad for more than 5 minutes in my life. And I was like, oh, that's surprising, because you seemed really close. And he said, yeah, we were. I really loved him, but that just wasn't on the agenda with men of his age. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so my dad probably saw himself, in comparison to his father, as extremely open-minded and sensitive, because you always do feel more like that than the generation before you. But to my mind, he seemed quite sort of closed off to those sorts of issues,
Yeah, I think that there have been generational changes, and I think like young men these days that I meet, I think they're amazing, actually. Sort of like really, far in advance of where I was when I was their age. So, my hat's off to them. Sort of really amazing guys. But I am of that generation that was sort of in between, I think, is what you're describing.
Yeah.
They sort of 1970s was when I was at school, and that was when feminism was coming in and changing stuff, and which actually I think opened up the door for me later on in life. I remember having a conversation with my dad once. This is hilarious. I was peeling some potatoes in the days when you peel potatoes before you boil them, right? But I was peeling some potatoes ready to cook them, and my dad said, "What are you doing?" I said, I don't know, I'm peeling potatoes. He said, "Why are you doing that?" I'm like, "Because I want to eat them." But no, women do that for you. And literally, he said that. Do you know what I mean? I was like, what? Not the women I know, mate. So, there have been definitely changes. But again, those cultural shifts are really important, but they're in contrast to what I was saying earlier on about adverse experiences. So, society has shifted for the better, I think, in many ways, in terms of men and men's roles. And that's a really important message to get across to guys, that the world is different now. But there's a difference between, being stuck in the mud around cultural shifts and promoting adverse experiences in parenting. And I think we need to be really clear with blokes about that. There are things you can do as a bloke which are really unpleasant and nasty. And then the things you can do just because you want to be a bit of an arsehole, that's all right. That's all right. Whatever. Do you know what I mean? And so making that distinction. So it's interesting. So, but drugs and alcohol were featuring early. It was just part of the culture. You move into writing and the creative industries. And I guess, what was that like? I mean, that period of time must have been quite a laugh in many ways.
Oh, yeah. It was, I've been really so lucky in my career because I grew up, whilst I had I could see that my dad was able to make money out of coming up with ideas, which was great. But on the other hand, I had my mum who was working almost always in quite low paid jobs that she didn't enjoy at all, and was always exhausted and stressed. And, I look back and I just can't believe how she did it without falling into, I often say to her, I can't believe you didn't become an alcoholic or something, because, you had more pressure than I've ever had in my life. And you somehow wrestled yourself through it all relatively unscathed. And so I saw that, that to me was like, work basically sucks. It's like, work is a nightmare. That was what I saw my mum going through. It's like, but she was good at making the best of it and having a laugh wherever she worked. But on the whole, it was badly paid, boring work. And so I was very aware that was what, for most people, working life was like. But I had ambition, which I probably think I got a bit from my dad, but a lot from watching my brothers. And that's why I was always very good at writing at school. And I was always could make people laugh. And so I thought, I can get into this journalism game, right? I can get into the fun bit of journalism, which at the time seemed to be the magazine industry. And so I just had a self-confidence about that. I think, in life, it's like what you see as realistic and possible is a big factor in what you're able to achieve, And I didn't think it'd be easy, but I thought, I looked at the sort of stuff that I read about, and I thought, this is the stuff I'm into, right? And so whether it was music or football or movies or just having a laugh with your mates, this was the sort of stuff that people were covering in magazines at the time. I thought, I can do that. I can write as well as these guys. I'm as funny as these guys. I'm going to get in there and do it. And so, I did it. And I launched a men's mag for the biggest publisher, the biggest magazine publisher in the country at the time, IPC, hired me from Men's Health to start a brand new launch, which gave me a huge amount of experience very quickly. Because when you work on the launch of a magazine, it's a small team, and so you end up doing a lot of all of it yourself, sort of thing. You're writing practically every article in the first issue and stuff. And so, after that, I felt like I was flying by the seat of my pants. And eventually, I went freelance, and I started writing for the Guardian and other newspapers, and was, spreading my sort of profile far and wide. And that led into broadcasting work. I started getting invited on TV and radio and doing that sort of thing. And so, throughout the noughties, I was, I did feel like I was flying by the seat of my pants, and that work never seemed particularly difficult to come by. And I was just having a whale of a time most of the time. But the truth is that I was constantly suffering from quite bad anxiety.
Yeah.
But I never realized that at the time. I never had that word anxiety. I just harbored what I thought were really bad fears all the time, an inability to relax or stop worrying about shit. And that the only time that I wasn't was when I was having extreme fun. So I think I fell into this thing of the only time I associated being happy with doing something extremely fun.
Yeah.
And any time that I wasn't in a state of extreme fun, I thought, then I'll be sad and miserable. Yeah. So it was like life just seemed black and white to me because I didn't know any better. I knew nothing about balance, you know.
Yeah. And so because you didn't have the knowledge and insight to understand that you were having symptoms of something, which is how I would say it, you definitely didn't have the knowledge or insight to understand you could get treatment for those symptoms, and you can make other choices. So it's a very familiar story to me, is that people adapt the way they live to compensate for discomfort.
Yes,
particularly psychological discomfort. That's what people do.
Yeah.
And they do it if they don't understand that there's other ways of managing that psychological discomfort, which is, I think, very typical for many men still today. And I guess you were in a space where you were thinking, this is just the way I am.
Yeah, right? Totally. You just summed it up, the words you just used. That's exactly what I now see is the correct analysis of the way I was living. I just, no one knew other than perhaps my girlfriend, who's now my wife, knew the extent to which I was able. I had a very larger than life, confident Jack the Lad persona, always having fun, always being funny, always like the loudest guy in the room, whatever. And yet she knew that, I would spend days or weeks being really miserable, worrying about everything, constantly catastrophizing. And I didn't know that there were other ways of coping with it. I didn't know that it was even a thing. That was the other thing. I couldn't acknowledge that any of this was a big problem. And I think that
and you would have laughed at people who just said to you, you've got a problem. What do you mean? Look at my life. What do you mean I've got a problem?
Yeah. I would have thought, A, slightly insulted. Like, don't you understand what a successful, happy life I have? And B, I would have felt a bit ashamed because I'd have thought, oh my God, and this whole kind of first world problem phrase, which is awful that people use. And it's such a massive hindrance to men who are trying to face up to the fact that they have issues, emotional, psychological issues that are affecting their life very badly, but they can't acknowledge that these issues exist because they think I'm too privileged to justify them.
And
that's
that
what I
other
thought.
Horrific term, a snowflake. Do you know what I mean? It's like,
exactly. Like, oh, boo-hoo! Look at you. You might go, with your nice house, and I was guilty as anyone of being like that. I write in my book that if any of my older brothers had come to me and opened up and said, I'm really struggling at the moment, I'm really actually I think I might be depressed. I would have been like, I can imagine myself being cynical about that and going, oh, boo-hoo, look at you with your big house and and all the money you've got in the bank and your nice car, and you're a bit depressed, are you? And I would have been like that. That would have been my attitude. And because that was my attitude, that was what I obviously projected and thought that other people would say about me. So I was involved in a nasty game where we all judged each other for having feelings. And therefore, there was no way I was ever going to be open and honest to myself, let alone anyone else, about my own issues.
So it's interesting that. And the book is called Sort Out Your Head, or Sort Your Head Out. Right, just so that people listening can have a link to it. So, I mean, it's interesting because there's a number of things clinically that as a therapist I think about. And it's a story, it's a very familiar set of sentences that I've heard again and again and again. So there was this thing you were doing, which was compensating for these uncomfortable symptoms by using coping mechanisms that are ultimately going to destroy you, which is drink and drugs. But also because of the psychological shame, the disconnect, the negative self-talk, like if I tell people about what's going on, even if I recognize that I had a problem and then told people about it, it's not important enough. And that's a classic from men. It's not important enough. What I feel is not important enough to do anything about. It's an absolute classic for men. And what that leads to is a situation in which, and there is a gender distinction to be made here in terms of mental health presentation or mental illness presentation. Women tend to present more in the anxious, depressed stage of a mental illness. Men wait until they're ready to kill themselves or they're locked up in a ward. That's what happens, right? And then it's serious enough when you're just about to run your car into a wall. Suddenly it's serious enough. And what I would say to blokes is it really sensible to wait until that point? Because actually, the anxiety and depression symptoms are the early warning signs.
Yeah.
That there's a problem, right?
And I think that's so true. And you're right. The way of fixing it, all I can do is look at myself and think, how could have I? Because I don't think I wasn't suicidal, although I had some pretty dark thoughts about the pointlessness of life, which may well have been a stepping stone to suicidal thoughts.
It's literally on the. We have an objective form to measure it, and that's step one.
But I was in a crisis because I knew that my drinking and drug taking was, by any objective, I've told myself for years, kept comparing myself and thinking, well, at least I'm not doing that. And it's that word yet. Well, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing coke in the morning yet. But by the end, I was doing coke in the morning.
Of course. Yeah, and
you know what I mean? And that was when I realized, okay, so it was a complete crisis point. And when I talk about the first time I went to seek help, it was, exactly as you described it. It was just desperation. I didn't really want to seek it, but I had at least faced up to the fact that there was no controlling it, and it was only going one way. And I was starting to think, I wasn't thinking I'm going to kill myself, but I was thinking, there's a big chance I could keel over and have a heart attack. And then my kids were very young, and I was like, if I don't do this, I will die soon. I will have a heart attack, or I'll get run over by a bus. And then my kids will grow up without a dad. And I thought, so it was only crisis that drove me to it. So then I think, well, what would have got me to sort of, go and seek help at an earlier juncture? And it would have just been more open conversations. And ultimately, that's what I do. If I saw people, it wasn't like I'd never heard or seen a man open up about problems, but they kind of fell into two groups for me. There were either men who seemed like complete, like they'd had a complete car crash existence or experience, and they were totally broken, and they were full-blown addicts, and their lives were totally screwed. And
20 minutes away from death because my hand sticking up through the snowdrift. That's
exactly. So it was either those guys, or there were guys who I would have regarded, the old me would have regarded as a bit posh and touchy-feely, and there was slight hippie-ish vibes. And I'm like, God almighty, I can't, that's not me. They don't talk like me. They don't think like me. They won't be able to relate to me.
I have to admit, I've been in this field 30 years as a psychotherapist, and I still feel that. I've never got over it from my working class roots. I have to say, it's my problem.
Exactly. And they were prejudices that, of course, there probably are people who are a bit like that, but it was entirely my own prejudices. But those prejudices existed because ultimately there weren't many guys. The guys who tended to speak out were either massive crisis people, right, who had such extreme stories. It almost had the reverse. It made me less likely to seek help because that was the benchmark. I'm like, the benchmark's him.
I've still got a long way to go before I get to there.
He ran over his own child, or something like so extreme that you sort of think that's the benchmark there. And so them sharing their stories almost worked against me wanting to seek therapy. So I suppose, if something had been different, it would have been if there was a bloke I could relate to who was maybe in a grey, regarded himself as being in more of a grey area in terms of his substance abuse, or maybe it wasn't even substance abuse. Maybe it was a bloke who I could look up to for the things that I did look up to when I was younger. He was just someone who I could relate to. Maybe he was tough, maybe he was funny, maybe he was cool, or whatever other superficial thing would have made me think, oh, he's a good bloke. But he's there saying that he goes to therapy because he, sometimes struggles with excessive worry. I'd think, oh shit, that's like me. Maybe I should do it. I kind of needed someone. My younger self needed someone who could present it, I suppose, as just sort of more of a normalized and sort of cool thing to do.
Absolutely. And just having those conversations, it's interesting as you're describing yourself. What you're describing is somebody who is increasingly isolating themselves from human contact. and limiting their contact to just one person, which is again a very bloke thing to do. And that one person being your wife, and she knew what was going on, but nobody else did because you withheld it from them. And then you went to see a therapist. Do you remember what that was like, that moment of going, right, I'm going to go and see a therapist? And sort of, was that really quite existential? Like, oh my God, everything I've ever thought is gone.
I remember it. Well, I'd gone to see a therapist a few years beforehand. So in about 2011, I had just had I was about to have my second child. I was totally overwhelmed with work.
Yeah.
I was burnt out. I was stressed. And all the little kind of periods or blasts of anxiety and depression I'd had in the past, and I'd failed to notice them as like warning signs, and I just ignored them and moved on. Finally, it all came to a head, and I absolutely just, it was a crisis for sure. I don't know whether it was a breakdown or what, but certainly I wasn't sleeping for days and days on end. I couldn't function properly at all. In desperation, I went to see someone. It was okay. I learned a couple of good things, but I don't know. I couldn't handle any kind of conversation.
Yes.
In the end, I came back from that. I went to the GP. They helped a bit. Life moved on. I kind of got better, and I just brushed it all aside, stopped seeing the therapist, and thought to myself, it'll be okay now. And then really what happened after that was it had been such a horrendous experience, like the worst experience of my life, just the non-stop like worry and catastrophizing in my head, the inability to sleep, the fear, the shame. And it was such a terrible crisis that I think that fed into me afterwards in the subsequent years. Whenever I had a hint that I might be going back to that dark place, I basically reached for the bottle or reached for some drugs, right? Because I was terrified then, because that particular episode of the black dog visiting me had been so terrible that I just thought the first hint of trouble, the first hint of a bit of bad news, or the first hint of waking up in a bad mood, bang, I'd be in the pub, I'd be doing coke, I'd be just trying to numb myself out for fear of it coming back. And then that in turn led to a 2-year period where it was seriously bad, dangerous and extreme substance abuse. And so that is why in the middle of the night one night, thinking this is only heading one way and it's probably death, certainly the collapse of my marriage, because my wife at that stage had said, listen, this is a problem, you're drinking way too much. She didn't even know about the amount of drugs I was doing, but she certainly had worked out how much I was drinking, and she wasn't happy. And in the middle of the night, wide awake, as I often was in those days, I went on the Priory website, simply because the Priory was, A, like most people, I'd heard of it, and B, it was like walking distance from where I live. So I thought, maybe I just need to go in there. I've tried everything else. And they offered a free consultation, like an assessment. So I applied at like 3 a.m. using their kind of website form. And the next day I was at work and I'd actually forgotten about it. But I got an email from an actual person, which I wasn't expecting, because sometimes you fill in forms on websites and you just get an automated chatbot. And an actual person using her, Christian name got back and said, oh, you've applied to do this. Do you still want to? Because I've got some appointments tomorrow if you want to do it. And I was like, shit, I've forgotten about that. And I almost just didn't reply, because in those days I was just completely whimsical. And that was just something I thought about then, but I'm not going to do it. But it was quite a nice email. So I replied, said, yeah, all right, I'll come in. And then even on the actual day, I thought, I'll probably blow that out. I'm not going to do that. It'll be weird and it'll freak me out. I often think the reason I made a sort of spur of the moment decision to go was out of journalistic curiosity. I'd always heard about the Priory and I was interested to know what went down there and what it looked like. And so that's, I'm a curious person. So I just thought, fuck it, I'll drive up there. It's free and I'll probably not continue with it, but it's half an hour out of my life. So I went up there and I met this woman, and the way she spoke to me was quite matter of fact and amusing, and little things I'll always remember had an impact on me. The main one being the fact that she swore just as much as I did, which immediately disarmed me, because going back to what I said earlier, I assumed everyone would be a bit touchy-feely or like a hippie. or very clinical Sigmund Freud type stereotype. She was neither of those things. She was a recovering addict herself. So I felt totally at ease. She put me completely at ease at telling her pretty much everything that I'd been up to, all of which was, you know, the source of great shame. But, you know, I kind of immediately felt, oh, she gets it. She's one of us. Do you know what I mean? So that had a big impact on me. And then she said a couple of things to me. The main thing being, listen, clearly from what you told me, you do have a big problem. And if you want to stop completely, then I can help you. If you're interested in just cutting down, which is probably what I'd intimated to her, I can't. She went, I can't help you. And as a matter of fact, I don't think anyone is going to be able to help you if that's your goal. So it made it into a black and white decision, really. I believed her, and when I left, it was the first time it had been said to me, listen, there's a very simple choice. You either stop or you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to stop? If so, I'll help you, right? And so I drove away that day, and I thought, oh, right. And that played better to my all or nothing mentality as well, because I thought, oh, right. It hadn't occurred to me. I thought I could just get my life back to how it was 5-10 years ago, where I was just a Jack the lad having a few beers at the football, and go back to being happy and content and in control. But she's like, no, you're past that. Forget about that. That's not going to work. And then I drove away and thought, oh, right. So my only choice is to stop. And I thought, oh, that's quite appealing. I'm just going to be that guy who doesn't drink. Mm-hmm. And I went, she'd come back in a couple of days and tell me your decision. So I went back a couple of days. I said, I haven't drunk since I last saw you, and I've decided I'm going to stop forever. And I haven't drunk since that day, which was the 25th of June, 2015. And she's still my therapist. I still see her every week.
Right. Great. And did you do anything apart from seeing her? I mean, some people go to groups and things like that.
Yeah, I went to she really encouraged me to go to 12 steps, to groups, and I went. But you know, I still go once in a while. I never committed to 12 steps in a formal way. I've never had a sponsor. I think that I think my therapist would still think that I should. But I've spoken to other people, professionals, who said, listen, you know, you've done the 12 steps. I've read a lot around recovery, and I've read all of, you know, not all of them, but I've read a lot of the books, 12 steps and all the rest of it. And there's nothing that I don't agree with, and I'm a massive advocate of it. And people come to me all the time still, especially in the light of the book, and say, have you got any advice? I really need to take control of things. And I always just say something. I say, go to a meeting. Just go to a meeting, because it's free. There'll be one near you. You'll be surprised. It's not what you might be expecting. I think it'll be more positive than what you're expecting. I've taken people who are struggling to their first meetings. So I'm a total advocate of it. But for whatever reason, it's just played one part of my recovery. I will go in and out of meetings. I'll go in lockdown. I went to a lot of meetings on Zoom. I enjoy the atmosphere, but I'm not committed to go in every week. Partly because I've got a therapist, and frankly, I think she's been like a sponsor to me. And I don't know whether that is the right thing to say or not. And I don't think that she sees herself that way. But I certainly feel as if I know what 12 steps are, and I think I've been through them all.
My view is it's working for you. Why mess around with it?
That's what I think. Do you know what I mean? That's what I think.
I think
because I take
find whatever works for them, and that's
exactly. And I do take recovery very, very seriously.
Yeah.
And I see the power of groups. I see the power of all this sharing that I do on podcasts and in my book and on my newsletter. That's as much of a help. That's as much for me as it is for anyone else. I say it's to help other people, really, it's just as much for me.
Yeah.
And the conversations I have, I keep myself accountable. I reflect every day on my behavior and my mood. And, you know, I'm serious about this stuff. And so it's not like I just think, well, I just tick a box by going to one therapy session a week and that's all I need to do. You know, I'm thinking about this stuff all the time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So it's, I guess, transformed your life, making that decision. Your relationship with your partner will have improved, and your kids, and you're not worried about you're going to drop dead any day soon.
No, well, I try not to worry about that. But I still have my moments where I think that, but I suppose we all do as we get older.
Yeah. I mean, I have my moments, I'll tell you. So, but what, you know, if you could try and encapsulate what it is that you have benefited from it, what would you say it would be?
What, from therapy or recovery?
Therapy and recovery, however you want to frame it, to be honest.
I just have balance in my life. So I'm a more content person. I might go as far as say I'm I am happier.
Right.
People are sort of careful about their use of the word happy and happier because it seems more reasonable to say, well, you can't aspire to be happy all the time, but you can, you can aspire to be content. I'm genuinely so much happier than I was like 8 years ago. And my life has so much more balance to it. And that balance has come about by being more self-aware, more self-accepting, and, treating myself with a bit of love and kindness, which I never did before.
Yeah. I mean, similar. A lot of people say something similar. The way I characterize it, they say the big benefit is they become more comfortable in their own skin, and because of that, they're just less of a wank with everybody else.
Yeah.
And so they get this positive feedback from the world because there's suddenly this version of themselves that isn't, always wired and ready to kick off.
Authenticity. I still have moments, and I go running most days, and I often reflect on things like, so family get-togethers are a bit triggery for me, and I'll there'll be family get-togethers and I'll be 99% fine and having a lovely time, and then I'll just catch myself making a snide comment, nothing really confrontational, but it can live with me, and the next day I'll be out running, and the whole time I'll just be going, why did I say something that was maybe some passive aggressive remark that was designed to ultimately make the other person feel a bit bad about themselves? And I have that in me still. The difference is I would have just done that and thought it was either funny or just not given it another thought. At least now I can see when I make those little things, and I'll reflect on it for a long time and make a big effort to avoid it the next time I'm in a similar situation. So, progress, not perfection, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written the book, you have some podcasts, do you have a website? How do people get hold of you, hear about your story?
Well, the main thing is my book, which came out in February and was Amazon bestseller in the top 30 on Amazon. Sam Delaney, Sort Your Head Out, Mental Health Without All the Bollocks. And that sort of covers my life and, what I've learned about recovery and getting balance. And it's all written with a bit of humor and, is designed to sort of appeal to blokes who might otherwise feel alienated from these sorts of conversations. That grew out of my newsletter, which is called The Reset. And you can find that at samdelaney.substack.com. I started that in lockdown, just writing about this sort of stuff, and it took off and built an audience, and that's why the book grew out of it. There's also a mental health podcast that goes with that, called The Reset, where I interview kind of guys about their stories. And other than that, my website that covers all the other stuff I do, because I still do a lot of work outside of this mental health space. You can find that at samdelaney.co.uk.
Brilliant. Sam, a real pleasure to talk to you. Nice to catch up with another bloke who's got it. Do you know what I mean? And I'm totally with you that we have to think about how we communicate these messages in a very authentic and open way. And also, you found what works for you, which is unique to you. And that's the task, I think, is that people have to find what works for them as individuals. There isn't.
Piece together. You've always got to piece together a smorgasbord, haven't you?
I'm
different
totally
bits and
with you on that one.
Yeah,
Totally
and try everything. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
try everything. I've tried a lot of things that haven't worked, but at least I tried them, and now I've got like a sort of a mix of stuff in my life. That helps me, be a happier, more content person.
Yeah, and your kids are going to have a dad they can relate to much better going forwards. I mean, I'm sure they'll have their issues, but they won't have the issue of, which is a classic dad issue of, I never knew him. He was an absence. He was physically there, but in every other way, he just wasn't there. Do you know what I mean? That loss, that absence is the biggest sadness that most blokes have.
My kids would probably argue I'm too much there.
Yeah.
Because I'm around the house all the time and I can't stop oversharing with them or asking them about how their feelings are. And they're like, give it a rest, Dad.
That's better. All right. You stay there. Right. Brilliant to have Sam on. We've got We'll have another guest coming up soon. Oh, hang on, there's somebody calling me. There you go. That's Bruce. It's a live recording, as it were. My life is full of people calling me. Thanks, Sam, for joining us. We'll have another guest next week. I hope you enjoyed this week's. Do drop us some comments, and speak to you all soon.